Hello everyone, welcome to another 12-minute Mark. We're heading now into chapter 10 of Mark, coming into the second half of the book here, and Jesus, the major theme of the last few chapters, and we will continue on that theme, is the cost of discipleship. And what we saw last time was something about the children, that we have to be careful. The cost of the discipleship includes not letting children stumble. It includes understanding that you're not fighting to be the greatest. And what we find in the cost of discipleship, that Jesus doesn't go into a detailed study of all the finer points of theology in the Old Testament. There's a lot he's going to assume there, but it really pivots on relationships. And he's really, this section here might be called the family section because he's dealing with children, and now the Pharisees come with divorce. And we've had some sandwiches, and we'll hit a sandwich here in chapter 11, but this really isn't a sandwich where you have a story within a story, but it is a theme that is built, and that is, how is discipleship, how does it hit home? Literally, how does discipleship, a follower of Jesus, how does that hit home in the way that children are understood and treated and loved and cared for, and now the spouse. And so this is our domestic section of discipleship. And so then starting in chapter 10, Jesus left that place and he went through Judea across the Jordan, and large people came to him, and as was his custom, he taught them. But then some Pharisees came to him, and to test him, asked him, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" "What did Moses command you?" he asked. Moses said we could write her a certificate of divorce and send her away. "It was because your hearts were hard that Moses wrote you this law. But in the beginning of creation, God created them male and female. For this reason, a man will leave his father and mother, be united with his wife, and they will become one flesh, so that they are no longer two, but one. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no one separate." Now, when they were back in the house, the disciples asked Jesus about this saying. He said, "Anyone who divorces his wife to marry another woman commits adultery against her. And any woman who divorces her husband to marry another woman or to marry another man commits adultery against him." She commits adultery. So this, of course, divorce is a controversial subject today, and it was also controversial back then. And before we get into the divorce, it's easy to also skip some of these little sections. It may seem like a transition, but what we see here is that Jesus is crossing over to new territories, crowds coming, and it says, as was his custom, he taught them. Meaning that's the modus operandi. That's primarily what Jesus is doing. Jesus is the rabbi, the teacher. He's constantly explaining truth to people. That is the primary ministry. Again, Mark doesn't give us the long dialogues and monologues of the teaching. You go to the other Gospels for that. But it still is noted that this was his custom. This is the custom, that God's church is a teaching church. The office of teacher has to be maintained. You're only one generation away from extinction if you do not concern yourself with education and teaching. And so being able to apply the truth. So that's not all the church does, but that has to be a central concern, to put forth what God would require in his law and how it is applied through the Spirit. And so then the Pharisees, and we know their motivation, they're trying to trip him up, right? They've been following along at different places, trying to trip him up at various points. And so they're throwing these loaded political questions. It's almost like watching a political debate of today, in which people throw out loaded questions, trying to put people on the spot. There's no way that you can answer this. You can't really take a side. And if you do take a side, you're going to hack half the people. And so politicians have come up with various ways to skirt the middle of a lot of things as a defense mechanism to do that. And they're thinking, well, we'll see. We'll throw this at Jesus. This is a very difficult issue. It hits home. A lot of passion surrounding divorce. And there were a couple schools of thought on divorce. And so there were lines and camps that had already been drawn in Jesus' day concerning areas of divorce. And so, knowing they're trying to test him, Jesus appeals to their authority. What's your law say? Because they're not really asking, is it okay, or is it right, or is it ethical? They're saying, according to the law, can we do it? In other words, the way we interpret the loophole of this law or that law, can we get away with it and it still be okay? That's kind of the intent. And so Jesus, he follows up a question with a question. He does so many times to get people down a certain path to reveal truth to them. What did Moses command you? And they said, well, Moses did say that you could divorce and send her away. And then Jesus comes back with something that had to really silence people. I mean, it's just for him to say that, well, Moses gave you this law because your hearts were hard. We don't typically think of the Old Testament like that and the laws that are written there, that some of the material in the Old Testament might not have been exactly the way God intended, but was allowance that God made once the people were trying to exist in a fallen world. And so Jesus admits that, yes, Moses wrote this in a fallen world and made it allowable because your hearts were hardened. And perhaps it was episodes of mercy. I don't know what it could have been to why it was technically lawful to do it. But then Jesus goes back before Moses and says, well, because your hearts were hard in a fallen world, this was allowed for a time, but I'm telling you, this is the divine design of God. Here is his divine design from the beginning. So Jesus appeals now to the garden, to a pre-fallen state, and to explain what marriage is really about. And he says, now in quoting also Moses, just in Genesis, that God created male and female. And so we start to get the idea of marriage is not just tied to, it's not tied to romance. It's not tied to, well, I've got my job now. I might be buying a house. I guess it's just time to get married. That's what people kind of do. Or to help me with self-control, or maybe I want to have kids someday. There's all kinds of reasons. But what Jesus does is he ties marriage into the very design of creation. That some of this idea is the very purpose for being created male and female was for marriage. That is the design from the beginning. Before sin enters the equation, before loopholes are looked for, that's his design. And then he says, so that they're no longer two, but one. Now you can read that in Genesis. And in the Hebrew there, it says that the two will be like one. Like it uses a simile in Genesis. And in the Greek, when Jesus says it, he actually makes it stronger. He takes out the simile and makes it a complete metaphor that they are now one, that there's a spiritual unity that's there that cannot be taken apart. And you've heard that in weddings. You hear the minister say, what God now has joined together, let no one separate. And I used to always think, well, that other people would be out there and there'd be a conspiracy to forcibly get these people to divorce. But it's speaking to the couple. Let man not separate. He's speaking of the divorce, not that some foreign force or government is going to pull people apart. And this is big because, Jesus so far in his teaching about things that were so important to the Pharisees, the fasting, the ceremonial cleanliness laws, Sabbath observance, food laws, so far Jesus has been blowing all those out of the water and said that stuff really is important. Jesus has been somewhat one might even say sort of liberal when it comes to these kinds of constrictions. Those laws were there for a purpose, but they never really brought people into a greater relationship with God. They just set the people apart from the Gentile nations around them. And so we would expect Jesus to come up with something again. And the Pharisees, who were very super strict on all those other things, were actually quite open to divorce, probably because they were doing it. And so Jesus so far has been saying, we're not so concerned with all those little religious things, but when it comes to this relationship and the family, Jesus takes the hardest line that one can take on marriage and divorce. Usually he takes the line of freedom. Here he does not. Here he takes the line of God has joined these together in covenant. And later Paul will use that very covenant as the description to describe how the church is. That the body of Christ, or the bride of Christ, the husband and groom, the idea of Jesus and the church, that God has joined them together in a covenant. And to break that covenant is to break something that God has done, to go against God's design from the beginning. And so Jesus is super strict on this. And he doesn't say it in a parabolic way. And so when they go, so far we've seen, well, they go back into the house, they explain it. And Jesus didn't speak in parables. The disciples probably all understood divorce as a normal part of life. And Jesus, again, says very, very strictly, no, if you divorce to marry someone else, you've committed adultery. And we're looking even for that statement of, except for marital unfaithfulness. That's in Matthew. It's not in Mark's version. It's a very, very hard, a difficult teaching. But the idea is that that's what discipleship, that's the cost of discipleship. That's what we're talking about. And this is the cost in the family. And it starts in the family with a spouse. It starts the way you never let children stumble. And then it goes out from there. It's not just your faith being some public thing you do just on Sunday mornings or for a show. And so that takes us now into our next episode coming up, again, dealing with children, staying with the family. We'll see you again for another 12-minute mark.